magnum opus. You might not know this. Even if 200,000 people die, 20 years of stability. The Tiananmen Square incident, China's first and last democratization movement. Today we will talk about the Tiananmen Square incident, something you must pretend not to know even if you do. In 1989, an unprecedented large-scale democratization uprising, led primarily by students in Beijing, China, took place. Since the incident occurred centered around Tiananmen Square, located in Beijing's Forbidden City, we call it the Tiananmen Square incident. Surprisingly, however, only foreigners like us can call it the Tiananmen Square incident. The Chinese government, through its Golden Shield project, a real-life Big Brother system used to control and manipulate people, has designated the word Tiananmen itself as a forbidden term. Even the date June 4th, when the Tiananmen Square incident occurred, is censored, making it impossible for Chinese people within China to search for anything related to the Tiananmen Square incident. Some people refer to June 4th as May 35th. The famous Chinese novelist Yu Hua even published an article in a foreign newspaper titled The Spirit of May 35th. However, even May 35th has been designated a forbidden term, making it impossible not only to commemorate the victims of the Tiananmen Square incident, but also to learn about or express opinions on it within China. Thanks to the Chinese government's aggressive efforts to erase history, the majority of China's younger generation today is completely unaware of the Tiananmen Square incident. If you've watched shorts, you've probably seen interviews where Chinese people avoid answering or run away when asked about Tiananmen. I don't know if it's true, but it shows how intense the surveillance and censorship are. In China, you never know what might happen if you even mention Tiananmen. So what exactly happened in Beijing on June 4th, 1989, that the Chinese government is so desperate to erase as if it never happened? Let's go back to 1976. On January 8th, 1976, Premier Zhou Enlai, who was widely respected by the Chinese people, passed away. On September 9th, 1976, Mao Zedong died of a heart attack at the age of 82, leading to significant changes in China. Hua Guofeng, who had Mao Zedong's absolute trust, became his successor. Meanwhile, Deng Xiaoping, who had been ousted during the Cultural Revolution, arrested all four of the Chinese Communist Party leaders, known as the Gang of Four, who had led the Cultural Revolution. This brought an end to the Cultural Revolution, which had caused the deaths of anywhere from hundreds of thousands to 20 million people. While America's modern history is often described as tumultuous, it pales in comparison to China's. China's history isn't just tumultuous, it's filled with events that make you question, did this really happen? In other words, it's a complete mess. Deng Xiaoping succeeded in sidelining Hua Guofeng and consolidating power, allowing him to finally push forward with the reform and opening up policies he had wanted since Mao's era. Deng Xiaoping approached politics and economics from a pragmatic perspective, blending capitalism with socialism. In simple terms, while maintaining China's political ideology of socialism, he pursued thoroughly capitalist economic policies. Today, Deng Xiaoping is credited with laying the foundation for national growth through bold, pragmatic, open-door policies and is considered the most respected leader by modern Chinese people. However, his reform and opening up policies initially caused many side effects and faced criticism. First, his economic policies, centered on coastal regions, led to an east-west imbalance within China, which was criticized for causing extreme wealth disparities. Additionally, his excessive focus on reform was blamed for fostering corruption among internal bureaucrats. For example, in 1983, a dual-price system was introduced. This system required state-owned enterprises to sell coal, iron, machinery, and major capital goods at government-set prices, but allowed them to sell any production exceeding a certain quota freely on the market. In other words, they had to sell up to a state-set quota at low prices, but anything beyond that was up to them. Does something come to mind? Hoarding. Politicians and businesses colluded to buy up goods at the planned prices, which were half the market value, and then resold them for enormous profits. As a small group monopolized this, it caused massive inflation in China. By 1989, when the Tiananmen Square incident occurred, inflation had soared to 18%, and with high unemployment, citizens grew distrustful and resentful of the Communist Party. The crux of their discontent was that, despite rapid economic growth, wealth distribution in a socialist country was becoming increasingly unfair, exacerbating the wealth gap. In other words, people began to think that either the capitalism of the economy or the socialism of politics was wrong, and what people chose was capitalism. They believed that socialist politics was the problem. Intellectuals also believed that only democratic reforms could cure the ailing nation. Students, influenced by knowledge of foreign countries, democracy, and liberalism, began to see issues like wealth disparity and corruption as stemming from China's one-party dictatorship. In 1986, Fang Liji, one of China's most prominent scientists at the time, gave lectures to students praising Western democracy and criticizing China's state socialism and Communist Party dictatorship. The gist of his lectures was that abandoning the Communist Party system would solve nearly all social problems. Inspired by these lectures, students staged protests demanding democratization in several Chinese cities. At the time, although there was censorship of the press in China, people could relatively freely express their political opinions. However, after large-scale student protests broke out in late 1986, China began tightening surveillance on universities. Additionally, shortly after the protests, Hu Yaobang, the party general secretary who had garnered significant student support, was forced to resign due to criticism from conservative elders. He had clashed with Deng Xiaoping after protecting students during the late 1986 protests. About 3 years later, in April 1989, Hu Yaobang's sudden death from a heart attack sparked protests by Beijing University students demanding that the Chinese Communist Party reassess Hu Yaobang. At the time, posters appeared at Beijing universities with messages like, "The person who shouldn't have died has died, and the person who should die hasn't. People, wake up! Don't forget the struggle." The protests triggered by Hu Yaobang's death gradually evolved into demonstrations demanding more aggressive reforms and democratization. In other words, the Tiananmen Square incident was caused by the wealth gap and intensified political corruption resulting from Deng Xiaoping's rapid reform and opening up policies, the resulting distrust and dissatisfaction with the Chinese Communist Party, and the students' aspirations for democracy fueled by their exposure to foreign knowledge. People began gathering in the square starting on April 15th, and from the evening of April 17th, large numbers of youths and students occupied the area, refusing to leave even at night. The protesters set up tents and loudspeakers in the square, and 3,000 Beijing University students began drafting a document outlining their demands. Their demands were essentially sevenfold. First, recognize Hu Yaobang's views on freedom, democracy, and moderation. Second, acknowledge the people's demands for eradicating corruption and liberalization, and rehabilitate those who have been persecuted. Third, disclose the income of state leaders and their families. Fourth, allow private media and guarantee freedom of expression. Fifth, increase education budgets and raise intellectual salaries. Sixth, abolish the unconstitutional Article 10 of the Beijing People's Congress that restricts protests. Seventh, hold democratic elections to replace officials who made wrong policy decisions and fully report these demands through the media. In summary, their main goals were anger over high-ranking officials' corruption, media censorship, improving intellectual salaries, and democratic reforms. As numerous students united in sit-ins, the number of protesters grew and spread to other cities. The growing protesters succeeded in occupying Xinhuamen, the main gate of the Chinese Communist Party headquarters, on April 19th. Starting April 20th, Beijing police began suppressing students, but there was no extreme crackdown at this point, and with the increasing number of people gathering in the square, they achieved little success. On April 22nd, Hu Yaobang's funeral was held in Beijing. An estimated 100,000 students and young workers gathered at Tiananmen Square for the funeral. At this time, students requested a meeting with then-Premier Li Peng to submit a national petition, but their request was ignored. Subsequently, large-scale protests also took place in Xi'an and Changsha, leading to violent incidents. Intellectuals and students were trying to overturn the country, and from the perspective of China's leadership, they began to fear that the country might actually be overturned. As the situation unfolded, conflicts arose within the Communist Party leadership. Zhao Ziyang, the general secretary at the time, did not fully align with the students, but believed it was necessary to hold talks with the student activists and accept some of their demands. However, other officials believed that failing to suppress the student movement immediately could lead to the collapse of the Communist Party's one-party rule and a repeat of the horrors of the Cultural Revolution, plunging China into a major crisis. Amid the standoff, hardline conservative officials published an editorial in the People's Daily claiming that the student movement was a counter-revolutionary movement and that a small group with ulterior motives was using students to incite chaos. This enraged citizens further, and the next day, over 100,000 people, including not only students but also ordinary citizens from various professions and classes, gathered again in Tiananmen Square to express their anger. However, the hardliners' stance remained unchanged. They believed that since the editorial and warnings didn't make the protesters back down, suppression was the only option. Even at this point, the hardliners were not yet thinking of a bloody crackdown. They planned to use police, not the military, to suppress the students. On May 4th, as the 70th anniversary of the May 4th movement approached, more students joined the protests, and Zhao Ziyang expressed sympathy, stating that the students' concerns about corruption were rational. This was, in fact, a speech aimed at dialogue for reconciliation. However, the three student leaders known as the Triumvirate, Wang Dan, Wei and Chai Ling, continued the protests more aggressively. The reason they didn't stop, and why so many people joined, was that they believed this was their only chance, as so many people were paying attention. Students from the Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing erected a Goddess of Democracy statue in the square, expressing their resolute will, and starting May 13th, under Chai Ling's leadership, hundreds of students in Tiananmen Square began an indefinite hunger strike. The problem was that this was 2 days before Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev's visit to China. The visit was highly significant as it marked the official end of nearly 60 years of hostile relations between China and the Soviet Union. However, with students occupying Tiananmen Square and holding a hunger strike, the welcoming ceremony had to be held at Beijing Airport instead of Tiananmen, which was a deeply embarrassing moment. Additionally, numerous foreign journalists who had come to Beijing to cover Gorbachev's visit reported the chaos in Beijing to the world, leading to international embarrassment and criticism. For the Communist Party, this was the limit. With the situation now known abroad, they had to decide whether to resolve it or be overturned. According to the later leaked Tiananmen papers, Deng Xiaoping and the elders decided to declare martial law, believing that if the protesters were left unchecked after the Soviet leader's visit, the Communist Party would collapse, and if the Communist Party collapsed, China's economy would collapse. The Tiananmen papers are the minutes of the Chinese Communist Party's meetings, documenting the decision-making process for the bloody suppression of the Tiananmen protests. Ultimately, under Deng Xiaoping's orders, 250,000 People's Liberation Army troops began converging on Beijing. The Communist Party's plan was to enter Tiananmen Square at 1 a.m. on June 4th and forcibly disperse all protesters by morning. The military was also granted the authority to shoot if the protesters resisted or fought back. Deng Xiaoping even said that even if 200,000 people died, they would control the situation and secure 20 years of stability. By this time, the protesters had heard rumors that the Communist Party was preparing for a military crackdown, leading to divided opinions within the protest group. Some argued that they couldn't fight the military and should disperse, while others insisted on holding Tiananmen Square to the end. In fact, many protesters left the square preemptively, but many others stayed. As night fell on June 3rd, the military, led by armored vehicles and tanks, began entering Tiananmen Square. At the time, Deng Xiaoping issued the order for military suppression to Li Peng, saying, "Minimize casualties, but some blood must be shed." Many Beijing citizens tried to block the military's advance by using buses or trams to create barricades on the roads. These were people unrelated to the protests but opposed the military crackdown and did their best to obstruct the army. Beijing citizens even tried to persuade the suppression forces, but it was all in vain. The military fired on numerous Beijing citizens, obstructing their advance, and continued moving forward, running over living citizens with tanks. By the early morning of June 4th, the suppression forces arrived at Tiananmen Square as planned. They ordered the protesters to disperse through loudspeakers. Some protesters left the square, but others refused to disperse until the end. It's too gruesome to list every detail, but soldiers fired on resisting citizens and even crushed fleeing citizens mercilessly with tanks in a bloody crackdown. Soldiers also fired indiscriminately at civilian homes, killing unrelated people. Citizens fought back with Molotov cocktails, bricks, and other weapons, resulting in some casualties among the soldiers. But the number of civilian casualties crushed by soldiers armed with guns, armored vehicles, and tanks was incomparably higher. According to U.S. government estimates, up to 10,000 people may have died. By June 4th, all protesters in Tiananmen Square were either dispersed or killed, as the Communist Party had hoped. For reference, the Tank Man incident, The first thing that comes to mind when thinking of the Tiananmen Square incident occurred on June 5th, right after the Tiananmen Square incident. An unidentified man, whose name and age remain unknown, blocked 18 tanks entering the streets near Tiananmen Square, standing alone and unarmed, becoming a symbol of freedom and resistance. The man was selected as one of the 20th century's most influential figures by Time magazine in 1988. And even decades later, his image remains an iconic symbol of the Tiananmen Square incident. Thus, the Tiananmen Square incident ended in tragedy. What happened to the protesters who survived the Tiananmen Square incident? They dispersed after the Communist Party promised not to hold them accountable, but contrary to the promise, most of the student leaders who organized the protests were arrested and imprisoned. Wang Dan, the #1 wanted figure among the triumvirate, was imprisoned for several years, but was released on parole in 1998 at the request of Bill Clinton and exiled to the United States. He graduated from Harvard University and is currently a professor of political science in Taiwan. The other two members of the triumvirate also fled to the United States, enrolled at Harvard, and are living their lives safely while still speaking out on China's issues. It may seem surprising that the triumvirate is still alive, but this was possible because the Chinese Communist Party leadership's goal at the time was to teach Chinese society a lesson. They instilled a lesson, or rather fear, in citizens that challenges to the Communist Party would not be tolerated. This strategy was highly effective, and even today, many people don't dare to oppose the Communist Party. One final point to address is whether the Tiananmen Square incident can truly be called a democratization movement, as there are varying opinions on this. In fact, calling the Tiananmen protests a democratization movement in the full sense is difficult because the participants each held different ideologies. Some wanted to completely abandon the Communist Party system and adopt Western liberal democracy, while others simply wanted partial reforms to guarantee freedom. There were even those who praised the extreme nationalism of Mao Zedong's era, leading to internal conflicts and contradictions. One thing is certain, the hundreds of thousands of people who participated in the Tiananmen protests all opposed the Chinese Communist Party's political line. If their protests had succeeded at the very least, Winnie the Pooh probably wouldn't have been designated a forbidden term in China. This has been the story of the Tiananmen Square incident, China's first and last democratic uprising, which you must pretend not to know even if you do. That's all for this episode.